Hello and welcome to the Parents Podcast, brought to you by UCAS. This is your essential guide to everything when it comes to applying to university. My name's John Smith, and today we are looking at something which many parents will find daunting: applications to Oxford or Cambridge. There are a lot of differences. You have to apply earlier, the expectations are higher, and it can all be quite overwhelming. So we're going to get into it with the help of my guests on the podcast today. I'm joined by John Jeffries, who's a teacher at Warwick School. John, thank you very much for joining me today.
Lovely to be here.
Tell me a little bit about you then, because I know this is something which you are just so ingrained in.
Well, I went to Oxford University back in 1986, so I had an interview in 1985, and I've been a school teacher for over 35 years, and I've just always been really interested in university applications, but also, specifically Oxford and Cambridge.
We'll talk a little bit about what your interview was like, and we'll sort of cast your mind back a little bit. But we've got a lot to talk about today because there are a number of differences perhaps to other universities. So I think let's just start with some of the detail on that. What is it that makes applying to Oxford or Cambridge or Oxbridge, maybe we should start there, just where the term comes from, a little bit different?
Well, that's a good point, John, because there's so many myths involving Oxbridge, or in some parts of the world they still call it Camford. And immediately you feel as though you're being sort of pulled into some labyrinthine thing you don't really understand. And I think in the end, I think an Oxford or Cambridge application is actually quite a straightforward thing. There are certain things that you have to do, and we can talk later about the fact you do apply earlier than for other universities. But in the end, I think what matters is your enthusiasm for the subject and whether you think the way that Oxford or Cambridge teach and the collegiate system that they have, is that for you? And it's not for everybody, but it is for some people.
We're going to get into colleges and how all of that works. You mentioned some of the myths and some of the, I guess, the fears around it as well. Why do you think that is? Why do you think people feel differently about them compared to other universities?
I think there is a worrying amount of perceived elitism with Oxford or Cambridge. And down the years, many very clever pupils have said to me, "Oh, I don't think Oxford or Cambridge is for me." And I wouldn't really ever go for that approach. It could be that Glasgow isn't for you or Bristol isn't for you. Oxford and Cambridge are full of lots of really enthusiastic and intelligent young people. There are some traditions that Oxford and Cambridge have, which perhaps are different to other universities, but they're also very friendly places. And the very fact you have a collegiate system means that the college is your home. And very often, you go to some universities which are enormous, and your main focus is the department, and perhaps you don't meet people outside of the department if you're a medic or a historian or you're studying languages. Oxford, Cambridge have the collegiate system, so you actually live within a college, and the people you're living with in that first and second year, and possibly the third year, they're going to be studying lots of different subjects. So you might live on a staircase, and the person opposite you is studying modern languages and you're studying history, but your best friend is studying medicine. But your main focus is the college. And that can be a really great way of getting to know different people in a way that perhaps sometimes at other universities is more difficult.
So the collegiate system is still making my head fizz a little bit, John, to be honest. If I'm listening to this as a parent, I still might not be able to get my head around it. Can you just really bring it back to basics for me?
Yeah, I think the collegiate system is one of the most complex things to understand about Oxford or Cambridge. Basically, Oxford has, I think, 32 colleges within it. So one college might be Lincoln College, another college is Christ Church, a more modern college is St Catherine's. Cambridge is slightly fewer. I think they have 27 colleges. And again, you have colleges like King's College, you might have Selwyn College, you might have Sydney Sussex College. The important thing to bear in mind is that all of the colleges almost always offer every subject available at Oxford or Cambridge. So if you apply to Christ Church, it'll be a college of, let's say, 160 undergraduates in the first year, and some will study history, some will study modern languages, some will study medicine and maths. So basically every college will offer pretty much every subject. There are a few exceptions, but mostly colleges will offer every subject available. And the interesting thing is that you are applying to a college. Some people will do open applications, but most people are applying to a college. So you are applying for, let's say, history, but you're not applying for history at Oxford. You're applying for history at Lincoln College. You're applying for history at Christ Church. who are applying for history at Magdalen. And then it can be quite important just to work out how many places in that subject in that college are there. So I think that's one thing to really get your head around early on. They are collegiate colleges, and you're likely to be applying to a college, but actually all of those colleges will be offering all of the subjects available. Although, as I say, there are a few exceptions.
Why is that? Is that just because it's how it's been for years and years and years then?
I think it is
Yeah.
because Oxford wasn't founded as a university in the way that, let's say, Warwick University was established in the 1960s. It grew up over time. So basically, it would be clusters of academics, often, monastic academics, who were coming together in little groups in Oxford, and they gradually grew up into colleges. So basically, I think it's been a kind of a gradual evolution of over, let's say, 800 years. There was no one moment when Oxford or Cambridge were established at universities. The colleges were established over time. So there are some very late college additions at Cambridge. There are very late college additions at Oxford. I mean, I think St Catherine's is a 1960s foundation at Oxford, and I think it's Cambridge. You've also got later colleges like Selwyn, dating from the late 19th century. So the important thing is that you are applying to a college, so get to know your colleges early on.
Can those colleges be quite different
Oh,
then as
very
well?
different.
Yeah.
And I think that's one thing always to do. And I think also, by the way, Oxford and Cambridge are very different. I mean, Oxford is quite a big city. It's quite industrial. It's got car works. I come from Bristol, and when I went to Oxford, it didn't seem massively different.
Mm.
Cambridge is a much smaller town. I mean, it's not a city; it's a town, and it's in the east of England. It's possibly quite a remote part of the country compared to Oxford. And the atmospheres of Oxford and Cambridge are very, very different. Cambridge is much more bucolic. If you think about somewhere like Durham, if you think about a small town like Bath, that's a bit like Cambridge. Oxford is a much bigger city, and I think that makes a difference. The colleges, though, are also different. If you go to Oxford, let's say you go to a college like Magdalen or Balliol or Christchurch or New, yes, great traditions, extraordinary architecture, very, very beautiful, maybe even quite a few tourists looking around. But if you applied for a college like St Anne's or St Catherine's or Lady Margaret Hall, much more modern, a very different atmosphere.
So how much should that be in the forefront of your mind when perhaps you're supporting your child to apply when it comes to the colleges? Do you have to know which one they're going for?
Yes, I think it's quite important. And I think a really quite an enjoyable thing to do is if your child says, well, I'm thinking about applying to Oxford or Cambridge. As a family, you could do this. Just go onto the website, and there are about, I think, 32 Oxford colleges, slightly less Cambridge colleges. Now, that's a lot of colleges, and you could do it as a family. You could just go down the list, go onto the website for each of the colleges, and decide, is there a college which you absolutely love the look of? And it could be a beautiful old one. It could be a modern one. It could be a very, very big college. I mean, if you go to Oxford, you have, great colleges like Christchurch with a lot of people. And you have tiny colleges like Corpus Christi or Merton. And which one do you like the feel of most? And it could be that you make a little list. You think, well, I really like the look of those 4 or 5 colleges. Why don't you then go down and visit them? And you could even email the college and say, I'm really interested in applying to the college. Could I come down to have a look at it? Because I think one thing, I think Oxford and Cambridge colleges are a little bit like possibly grand hotels. You have porters outside and you think, oh my goodness, I couldn't go inside that. I'm not dressed for it. Just email them beforehand and say, I'd love to look around the college. Might I even be able to meet a tutor? And they will, and I think I can guarantee this, they will be very, very accommodating.
And I guess you'll be thinking about this perhaps a little bit earlier than other universities because there is the detail where you have to apply earlier, and then there are entrance tests, and there are lots of other things that you'll need to have in your mind when you're supporting your child through all of this.
I totally agree with that. And I would say that the application process, if this is something you're thinking about, I would begin it the summer after I finish GCSEs. Now, that might seem terribly early, but I mean, as I say, I applied to Oxford for history. And I remember pretty vividly for the 2 summer holidays beforehand, I loved history. History was my big thing. I wasn't a big all rounder. I was pretty terrible at some subjects, but I loved history. And I spent those 2 summer holidays just reading history books and visiting historical sites. So when I applied to Oxford, it was clear that I was in love with that subject. And one thing I tell my pupils, I don't think you should go for a speculative application. I might just get in. Because if you do an application like that, almost certainly you won't get in. I think you apply to Oxford or Cambridge if it's something that you really are in love with. So I'd say to all the parents out there, if you've got a child who's in love with engineering or with languages or with English, the best way to support them is to encourage that total immersion in the subject. If they love English, uh, take them to Thomas Hardy's home and have a look at it with them, or go and visit Jane Austen's home and then maybe watch Jane Austen films on television and then get them to read some of the books and get them to talk to you about it. Because I think that's what creates that love of the subject. And I don't think you can start too early, actually. And it can also be a labour of love.
So help them love it and help them show that they love it as well.
Totally. And also talk to them about it. I remember, my parents hadn't gone to university, but they knew that I loved history, and they would talk to me about it. And in a sense, every time they talked to me about it, it was like a mini interview. But again, sometimes, John, I don't like that word mini interview because they're not an interview I tend to associate with, job interview where you have a sparkly suit and you don't want to put a foot wrong. An Oxford or Cambridge interview is much more of a tutorial. It's much more what they call in Cambridge a supervision, whereby you've got 20 or 30 minutes to talk about something you love. So if for a parent, you've been talking to your child about history or politics or even engineering because they love it, and you say, well, tell me about it. Why do you love it so much? What's the most recent thing you've been reading? All of that is strengthening their application.
Let's talk a bit about interviews then, because you said I don't always like the word, but what can your child expect on the day of that interview?
Well, in the olden days, you would almost certainly go to Oxford or Cambridge. You would actually go to Oxford and Cambridge, and you would stay over if you went to Oxford 3 days, actually. You would actually stay in college. Nowadays, some colleges still personally interview, so they will request that you visit. Most colleges now do it online. So one of the really big things you've got to decide is, do you want to have your online interview? If you're fortunate to get one, do you want it at school or do you want it at home? And that's quite an important issue because if it's at home, it might feel more relaxed, you might feel more comfortable. If it's at school, though, if something technically goes wrong, they are more likely to have people who are going to fix it, which might reduce potential stress levels. So it wouldn't be one of those things I'd want to decide the night before. Oh my goodness, where am I going to do the interview? It's one of those things just to organise in the first few weeks of term. So what will happen is you will apply to Oxford or Cambridge before the middle of October. You'll be told if you have an interview probably by late November. And it's at that point that you decide, will it be at home? Will it be at school? And personally, I do see advantages for doing it in school.
Yeah, that's some really good advice. I wouldn't even have considered the stress you might have at home. You just assume that you just go, yeah, it'd be much more relaxed, but you've got somewhere
If
to
something
help.
goes wrong,
Yeah.
it could be horrible.
Yeah, exactly. Totally makes sense. On the flip side of that, entrance exams then, where do they fit in with all of this?
There are a variety of reasons why a college will take you. They're going to make a judgment based on a variety of factors. They're going to look at your A-level predictions. They may well look at your GCSE results. If you have an interview, they'll look at the interview. They're also going to look at your personal statement. Is it clear that you're in love with the subject? And they may set an entrance test. And this is something to check up sooner rather than later, because some subjects will require an entrance test, others will not. And you can't generalize about Oxford or Cambridge. Some subjects at Oxford will require a test, others don't. So in my subject, history, for years, there's been a history aptitude test, which I've helped to prepare pupils for. And this year, Oxford said, we're ditching it. We're not going to do a history aptitude test anymore. We're simply going to do it on your personal statement and on your reference and on your A-level predictions. So it's a moving target. different subjects will require different ways of getting in. If there is a test, I would really urge parents to ensure that their children are really preparing for it. In the olden days, you might have prepared for the old 11 plus, and if you were going to go for the 11 plus, you're going to work really hard for it, aren't you? I think it's the same for an entrance test. On the internet, there'll be lots of examples of former entrance tests. For example, in English, it's called the English Aptitude Test for Oxford. There'll be about 8 or 9 past papers. And I would do absolutely every single one of them. Because you don't want to be just in the top 50% on a test if one exists. You want to be in that top 20, that top 15%. Because if you've done super well in the test, you will get an interview. If you don't do very well, they may decide not to interview you. But if you've done jolly well in the test, they will be hoping that they can take you. So the interview essentially becomes an issue of, is this person going to be teachable? Is this going to be somebody who I enjoy teaching?
So we've talked a bit about preparing for the entrance exam, if there is one. What about preparing for that interview then? What are perhaps the most effective ways to prepare for that moment that you've got with someone and to help your child do that?
Well, I think it's a question of keep calm and carry on. What I've seen as a teacher for many years is some students can get very stressed about the interview and, oh my goodness, what if they ask me this? What if they ask me that? You can't really prepare for an interview at Oxford or Cambridge in the same way you prepare for A-level. If you're preparing for A-level, you're learning lots of detail. You absolutely know the syllabus inside out. An interview is a much more emotional thing. It's just seeing how you think. Are you somebody who would be an interesting person to teach for 3 years? Are you somebody who's prepared to take on new ideas? The important thing is they're not trying to catch you out. And I remember very vividly my interview at Oxford in 1985 for history. And I remember I really worked hard on the English Reformation. I could have bored for England on the English Reformation. I knew so much about it. It was embarrassing. And I remember I had this big argument that the Catholic Church was really super popular. The idea that the Protestantism was popular was a myth. That the Catholic Church was very popular. And the tutor, I remember nodding very enthusiastically at that point and said, but hold on. If you're saying the Catholic Church was so popular, how come Henry was able to overthrow it within a matter of 4 years? I mean, if it was so popular, how come people didn't, support it against Henry? Why didn't the church stand up to him? And I remember thinking, gosh, I hadn't thought of that. That's a hard question. And I said, can I have a moment to think about that? And then I said, well, I guess because it was so popular, it made the church rather complacent, that they couldn't really ever imagine that anybody would try to attack them. So maybe they didn't realise he was going to do it, and therefore they didn't stand up to him. And I remember the tutor saying, yes, I think that's a good point. I agree with that. I remember thinking at that point, gosh, I might have got in. But I couldn't have prepared for that.
Yeah.
It was something that was just, how do you think? Do you think as a historian?
But that comes back to the knowledge and the reading and knowing and loving the subject inside and out, I guess.
And if you're a parent, talking to your son and daughter about what they love. Don't just let them go off to their bedroom to do lots and lots of reading. At the end of the evening, say, hey, what have you been reading about? Tell me about it. And I think that'd just be a wonderful thing to do.
And I guess that helps with building confidence for your child as well, doesn't it? Then?
Totally.
Yeah.
And it's not as though I've got to do lots and lots of interview technique and interview practice. If during A-levels you're interested in what your children are doing, and that's not just true of Oxford or Cambridge, it's true of any university, that's something which I think parents can have an enormous impact on.
Kind of want to ask you more about the English Reformation now, but I'm not sure I know enough about it myself to ask you any important questions.
Yeah, okay.
Shall we talk a bit about that application process? And we've talked a bit about applying for a specific college. Is it better to do that, in your opinion, if that's what your child is thinking of doing? Because you can do an open application as well, right?
Yeah, you can do an open application. And I think the idea of an open application is you will be selected for a college which hasn't got masses of people who are applying for it, so it might increase your chances. I think if I'm looking at colleges, there's a bit of me that quite likes to apply for a specific college because that's the college I really like. I really loved Merton. I thought it was really wonderful. The things that I would always bear in mind would be, have they got lots of people studying my subject? Let's say, for the sake of argument, that you're applying for English, and there's a college that's got 5 people in the first year studying English, but another college has got 13 studying English in the first year. That information will be on the internet, and probably I'd apply for the college with a larger number of people studying my subject, because you can move the statistics somewhat in your direction. Let's imagine there are 40 people applying for 13 places. There could be 40 people applying for 5. So I'm not a big fan of playing the numbers game, but I remember Mr. Revel, who lives quite close to here and is still with us. So hello, Mr. Revel. He did say to me back in 1995, have a go at Christchurch, because there's lots of people studying history there. And also, by the way, if lots of people are studying your subject, you're likely to have a lot of friends who are studying the subject that you're in love with anyway. So it's quite a good thing for your emotional well-being.
I suppose that's just one part of the numbers game as well. If you're looking at your child's predicted grades, you might be looking at the colleges and wondering how that plays into it as well. Can you do a bit of that?
Yes, I think the important thing is, I mean, I wouldn't apply to Oxford or Cambridge if the school is giving you, I don't know, 3B's prediction at A level. But they are very, very unlikely to look at you. I think you will want to have a prediction for A level of about, let's say, 3 A's, maybe A star, AA, A star, A star, A. I mean, I don't like having to emphasize things like this, but you do want to have good predictions. Don't forget, parents, that your child could apply after A level. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that you've done really well at A level. You've got some fantastic results. You've got 2 A stars and an A. You can take a year out and apply after A level. You can actually have 2 bites of the cherry. And Oxford and Cambridge quite like people applying after A level because they're not mortgaging a place. They know that you've got 2 A stars and an A. So if you do super well in August and you really would like to go to Oxford or Cambridge, other universities I've found are very good at then saying, okay, fine, okay, we're understanding you're not coming. You will have to reapply through UCAS. You will have to take a year out. But applying after A level on the strength of your excellent results can be quite a good way of getting in. One issue too, which is quite important, is if you are at a state school or if you are at an independent school, if your child is an independent school, do be careful. There will be certain Oxford or Cambridge colleges which it will not be to your advantage to apply for, because they really are favouring the state sector. And so, for example, if you were at a private school and you applied to Worcester College, Oxford, you wouldn't have much of a chance of getting in because they want to have 93% of their pupils from the state sector, because that's where 93% of pupils are. So do look at the college you're applying for. And interestingly, particularly at Oxford, colleges will have different connections with different parts of the country. So I'm from the West Midlands. Keble has a close connection with the West Midlands. I think it's also the case at Cambridge. So just check up if there's an Oxford or Cambridge college which is focused on your part of the world, particularly if they're in the state sector, your child, that might be to your advantage applying to that college because they want to broaden access.
We've talked about some of the things which make applications to Oxford and Cambridge a little bit different. What about if you have applied to other universities at the same time, and then it comes to the point where you're trying to weigh all of it up, and your student and your child has got to make a decision? How can you think about doing that and weighing them up against each other?
I think there used to be I think it was a myth actually, that if you applied to Oxford or Cambridge, other very famous universities would get very cross and that they felt wouldn't look at you. So college universities like Durham and St Andrews and Bristol would be very angry and they were, my goodness, we want to be first choice. Nowadays, the other universities don't know what universities have applied for. I think it doesn't matter. I think that the really important thing is you apply to universities which you think that you are going to really in love 3 or 4 years of your life at. And I think if you applied to Oxford or Cambridge, you've still got 4 other universities you could apply for. And it could even be that those universities you prefer more. You could apply to St Andrews, which is a beautiful university in Scotland, or Edinburgh, or where I come from, Bristol, or of course Durham, or Manchester, or Birmingham. There are a wealth of wonderful universities in the United Kingdom. And it could even be that you have an offer from Oxford or Cambridge, and you actually decide, but the place I really, really want to go to is Edinburgh. And there'll be people who make that decision. I would never say that Oxford or Cambridge are, uniquely better than any other university. I think the reason we're doing the show is that there are certain ways in which you apply, which is not true of other universities.
And then what about the degree at the end of it then? As if it wasn't complicated enough, John.
Yeah, don't worry, John, because your degree will be from Oxford. It will be from Cambridge. Your degree won't be from, let's say, Pembroke College. You've studied at Pembroke College at Oxford. And actually, by the way, to make it even more complicated, there's a Pembroke College at Cambridge as well. You have studied at the college, but in the end, your degree will be either from Oxford or Cambridge University.
And the way that it works when it comes to the learning, there are some differences perhaps to other universities as well, aren't there?
Yeah. I mean, I think the learning is quite intense at Oxford and Cambridge. If you go to some universities, you go to lots and lots of lectures, you go to lots and lots of seminars, and maybe, you might do some extended work, you might do extended project work. Oxford and Cambridge really focus on, at Oxford, the tutorial system, at Cambridge, the supervision. So you won't have a system whereby you have, let's say, 8 months in my subject to become an expert on Disraeli. What will happen is at the end of the tutorial, the tutor might say, well, I think, what do you want to do next week? And I remember actually saying to the tutor, I'd like to do Disraeli. And he said, oh, that's really fantastic, okay. Here's a question for you. I think you're very enthusiastic about Prime Minister Disraeli, aren't you? And I said, oh, yes, I'm very excited by Disraeli as a Prime Minister in the 19th century. And he gave me this question, I remember it now. And the question was, to what extent was Disraeli responsible for keeping the Conservative Party out of power, 1846 to 1874? So he wasn't just saying, hey, write about Disraeli because he's a great Conservative Prime Minister. It was, let's look at it from the other way around. Actually, was he a bit of a failure? And I honestly think that's how Oxford and Cambridge work. They want you to look at things differently. And a lot of Oxford and Cambridge learning is what I call DIY. They're not saying, hey, this is what you need to know. They're saying, go and find things out for yourselves. So it can be quite a lonely form of learning, in that a lot of your time will be finding things out for yourself in libraries, online, and in laboratories. But also, it can be very, very exciting because you're finding things out for yourself. And that is a really wonderful moment when you're in a tutorial and it's just you and the tutor, or maybe 2 individuals in the tutor, and you really feel that you're in a shared learning experience. So if you want to be told what you need to know, don't apply for Oxford or Cambridge. But if your son or daughter is really inquisitive, they love finding things out for themselves, Oxford or Cambridge could be the place for them.
Oh, okay. So what about supporting your child then? Because there's a balance to be struck, isn't there? As always, there's supporting them without piling on the pressure. Have you got any advice, John?
Yeah. You must never, ever, and I've got 2 daughters, you must never pile on pressure. I think you get some children who think, oh gosh, there's an expectation on me to apply to Oxford or Cambridge. I've done brilliantly at GCSE. I've got countless numbers of A stars in GCSE. Therefore, there is an expectation that I apply to Oxford or Cambridge. I would never say that Oxford or Cambridge are the best universities in the country. For goodness sake, it could be that you would do medicine much more successfully and enjoyably at Sheffield. Sheffield's got an amazing medicine course. So I think you don't want to make Oxford or Cambridge seem so important that if we don't get in, oh my goodness, I could have gone into Oxford or Cambridge and I didn't. You will go to a wonderful university, and I would keep emphasizing that point. We just want you to be happy. And if you get into Oxford or Cambridge, you might spend 3 wonderful years there. But if you end up going to Bristol or Exeter, you will equally well spend 3 wonderful years there.
I suppose it's also important to recognise, particularly perhaps thinking about this as a parent, when you need to give your child a bit of space as well and let them, think about what the next steps are for them.
I think my big advice would be not to make too big a thing about it. If your child decides to apply to Oxford or Cambridge, oh, that's fantastic, wonderful. But equally, if they were applying to Bristol, that's fantastic, or Loughborough, that's fantastic. The important thing is just right from the word go, talking to them about their subject. Wow, tell me about Thomas More, which you're doing in English history. tell me more about that. It sounds so interesting. It's not like in December, oh my goodness, we've got an interview coming up. Quickly, we're going to do lots of interview practice. That would massively pile on the pressure. So it's absolutely not a sprint. It's an enjoyable marathon where you're just continually supporting your child.
I was going to ask if there's one thing that you would like a parent listening to this to take away from our conversation today, but is that it? Does it come back to that love of the subject and helping them with that? Or something else maybe?
No. I think it just comes down to talking to your child about things that they love. And that's what my mother did with me. She hadn't been to university, but she knew I loved history. And the amounts of times we just talked about history, I think that's what got me into Oxford or Cambridge. Got me into Oxford. Didn't go to Cambridge.
John, thank you so much for coming in, sharing your experience of the application process and now what you help some of your students through and indeed your children as well. It's really good to chat to you today.
Lovely meeting you, John.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you as well for joining us for this edition of the Parents Podcast, where we have looked in detail at those Oxford and Cambridge applications, how they work, the differences there, and hopefully you've taken something really valuable away from our conversation today. I've been John Smith. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you'll come along again next time.
Stay informed with expert advice straight to your inbox. Sign up now for key updates, deadlines and guidance to help you support your young person with confidence.